Good evening. Welcome to episode 88 of the Political Mike podcast. You've got to go back to 1934 to find another year in which the president had saved all of the senators within their own party. All seemed to be looking up for the Democratic Party. That wasn't until thorn in the side of Democrats, Senator Kristen Sinema of Arizona, made an announcement that she was going to now change her party affiliation officially to be an independent, complicating the Democrats' 2024 political map. Top appropriators on Capitol Hill say they have an agreement on the numbers needed to flesh out a final funding package by Christmas. Biden hosted dozens of African leaders this week for a 3-day summit that began Tuesday. And of course, this crazy week started with President Biden engaging in a prisoner swap that resulted in Brittney Griner's return to the United States from Russia after 10 long months. Brittney Griner, of course, arrived in the United States early Friday of last week, landing at Kelly Field in San Antonio, Texas. The WNBA star, who was held for months in Russian prisons on drug charges, was released in a one-for-one prisoner swap for notorious international arms dealer Victor Bout, also known as the Merchant of Death. Here to help me make sense of all of this are regulars on the Political Mic and once new guest. And so Mr. Elias Empire is Illusion Empire is someone who is a historical genius, someone who is a political novice, and I'm so glad to have his input on the Political Mic today. So, Mr. Elias, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Mike, for having me on the show. Hello, Jerry, Jordan, and I think Professor. Are you Professor Fred Cook as well? Yeah, hi.
Yeah, awesome. We also got Jerry Ford, who's going to be joining us again, who's a private equity and M&A associate at Sidley Austin LLP. He's a graduate of Howard University and received a master's degree in public policy from the University of Houston. Before attending law school, Jerry hosted a daily radio talk show on KJOZ 88:00 AM in Texas, and he has made numerous television appearances on Fox 26 News and KHOU 11 as a political commentator. Jerry, thanks for making the time to come back on the show. We've also got Professor Fred Cook, an adjunct professor at Howard University School of Law, who is a member of the D.C. Bar and also a practicing attorney, former prosecuting attorney as well, someone who adds so much depth to the show. Thank you for being back on, Professor Cook.
Thank you, and Rue to Mr. Strudwick.
And of course, Jordan Strudwick, another good friend of mine from Howard University School of Law, who is working now with a fintech startup. Jordan, could you remind us what the fintech startup's title is?
Zimbali Networks.
Symbolic Networks. Awesome. Nate Honore, who is a recent graduate of Quinnipiac University School of Law, who's also a wonderful political mind to have, and I'm so grateful to have his input in today. And Nate will also be working in a firm in Connecticut coming up soon. And then finally, we've got Dr. Blaine, who it is a privilege and honor to have her back on with her expertise. She is an author, someone who is very well versed in political issues, as well as historical issues. Professor Dr. Blaine, thank you so much for being a part of the show. She has practiced medicine for over 30 years. She's watched the changes that have turned patients into customers and medicine into an industry. Her book, Undue Influences, was written in response to a wave of extremism that has fractured our communities, in which so many have asserted their opinions simply by following their friends in their political parties, and the barrage of fake news that abounds from both sides of the political aisle. And so this book, of course, is an excellent read, and I'm getting into it right now, actually. So, Dr. Blaine, thank you so much for being on the show. So, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to start off the conversation by asking you, talking about Senator Sinema's recent departure from the Democratic Party. The Arizona centrist turn to independent status is shaking up the Senate's 2024 map just days after Democrats closed this year's midterm battle with a huge win in Georgia, with Senator Raphael Warnock coming out on top after the December 6th runoff. Senator Sinema isn't the only one ramping up the pressure on the party. You've got Representative Ruben Gallego of Arizona, who could soon force Democrats into tough spending decisions as he explores a bid that could produce a brutal three-way race if Sinema runs again. A lot of political pundits have foretold or forecasted a three-way race, which would be disadvantageous to the Democratic Party, being that you have Sinema being able to pull away what they suspect would be centrist Republicans. What do you make of that forecast? Do you think that there's any merit to it, or do you think that because she's no longer part of a national political party machine, there's no chance for her to get reelected or even damage the eventual nominees of either party?
Yeah, Mike. Look, she presented this as this was a principled decision, that she was representing the majority of Americans who identify as, independent thinkers and voters. But to be clear, like, this was not an independent principled decision, right? This was very self-serving. It was very strategic, politically strategic. The truth of the matter is that the Arizona Democratic Party has censored her a few times. She has been an issue for the Biden administration with some of these very large landmark type of main agenda issues when dealing with voting rights and a lot of issues that is at the forefront of the progressive agenda. She has stood on the other side of this, right? She has been in the pocket of the special interests, and I think it was clear to her and the people advising her that she had a very difficult time. She would have a very difficult time winning a Democratic primary. So you had, Congress, men or people who are already getting prepared to take her on in the primary coming up, and she would have had a very hard time winning that primary. So for me, it seems very strategic. It was a very political move. Now, does it change the outlook of Democratic Party right now? Like, look, she's going to caucus with the Democratic Party. You already have two other senators, Bernie Sanders. You have Senator King, who are independent, voters, but they're caucus with the Democratic Party. So the Democrats will still have a majority. You couldn't count on her with these major, big progressive agenda items, previously, and you won't be able to count on her now, right? So the question would be like, what does this say about 2024? With the election, look, we might have a different senator in Arizona, but that senator might be a Democrat, right? To me, it was very opportunistic. She painted this as a very principled decision, but this was very self-serving, opportunistic, and it lines up with what she has shown us in her few years in the Senate.
Yeah, what Jerry said, basically, I think it's also important to bear in mind that in Arizona, Democrats hate her, Republicans hate her, and independents hate her, right? Arizona does have a tradition of electing independent-minded senators. John McCain, for example, is someone who had a very long legacy of being viewed as a moderate, even though his voting positions were not always so moderate. But the difference between Kyrsten Sinema and John McCain, who was such a legend out in Arizona, is that John McCain was known for his constituent services. Kyrsten Sinema has not held a town hall in years. So she doesn't answer to anybody. She doesn't answer to the only people. She doesn't answer to Joe Biden. She doesn't answer to Kamala Harris. She doesn't answer to Chuck Schumer, and she doesn't answer to her own voters. The only people she answers to, it seems, are her donors. And so, understanding all of this, she felt the best way to preserve her viability was to, drop her party affiliation. But the difference, of course, is that her state party hates her. Right? The difference between Kyrsten Sinema being an independent versus Bernie Sanders and Angus King is that the Vermont and Maine Democratic parties, respectively, agree not to nominate candidates so that there can still be a strong voice in the Senate who will align with Democratic principles. In fact, Bernie gets offered the Vermont Democratic nomination every 6 years. He just turns it down. And this really is a decision that only makes sense to Kyrsten Sinema because it doesn't change the Senate math in any way. Democrats still have a majority, and because she has not crossed party lines completely, they're going to keep that majority. And again, Democrats have now 2 years to make a three-way race in Arizona the Republicans' problem. Republicans in Arizona are probably going to be turned off by the fact that she didn't caucus with Republicans. What was trending on Twitter for a while, actually, was that Sinema voted with Biden over 90% of the time anyway. So, if you're saying, I don't want to be beholden to Joe Biden, and you're still voting with Biden 9 out of 10 times, you're not really going to get Republican voters. And I do think the independents in Arizona, the big thing with independents is that they tend to vote one way or another anyway. They're not switching their vote, every single election. So you do have to remember that independents in Arizona are not just some, abstract concept. They're real voters, and they might not be very happy with her either.
And that's in addition to what you said, Nate, about her not having town halls, there is no method to her madness. At least with John McCain, you understood that, for instance, as it pertains to healthcare, he was not going to vote to repeal Obamacare if there was no replacement, because he didn't want to go back to his constituents and explain why all of a sudden they don't have healthcare anymore after a number of years. She never explained any of her positions. You never understood why she served as a monkey wrench for the GOP when it came down to the Build Back Better proposal, which eventually became what we know now as the shrunken down version, which was the Inflation Reduction Act. She never explained herself as it pertains to a number of other votes that progressives were usually on board for. Yet, if you take a time machine and go right back into the early years of the Obama administration, she was criticizing Joe Lieberman for the very same thing she's doing now, which is being that roadblock in the way of democratic progress.
She was a Green Party activist before all of this. I think that's what's so crazy.
And look at the polling. Joe Biden's at 80% in Arizona among favorability among Democratic primary voters in that state. Mark Kelly, the incumbent senator, 83%. And then you have Kristen Sinema at a small 19%, a dismal 19%. Obviously, there was some political calculating on her part, even though her announcement made it seem as if she had a change of heart, that she's been who she's always been, that this is just a reflection of the Kirsten that they sent to Arizona. But they didn't send a Kirsten to Arizona. They sent a Democrat. Anyone else? Dr. Blaine.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you guys and I disagree with you guys. I don't think that there's going to be that much actual difference in the way she votes, and I don't think it's going to make that much difference in the Senate that she's now an independent. It probably, I feel like, would hurt her more in the elections if she's looking to be reelected in a couple of years. So, I mean, maybe, we all do things. Everyone who does whatever they do, there's something in it for them. That's the case. Anybody who's up for election, don't ever think that they're being selfless. So, to say, well, she's doing this for herself. Of course she is. But I kind of like the idea that, I wish it would start a movement that people could be independent. I hate the fact that we have Republicans and Democrats and people are supposed to vote a party and not necessarily a principle. I'm not trying to confuse it with her saying she was voting her principles, but, I think that that the senators should vote their conscience before their party. I mean, it's a big issue that we have in this country. And I don't know what would happen if we, like Israel's got like 12 different parties, and that's a disaster too. So I'm not saying to do that. It's just, the idea that if you're a Democrat, you have to agree with whatever the Democrats decide. And if you're a Republican, you have to agree with whatever the Republicans. This is one of the problems that we have. It's one of the things that causes extremism, that causes people to not think through an individual issue and just say, well, this is what my party wants, I'm going to go with it. So I kind of like the idea, and I wish more senators would do that, would just say, you elected me. Hopefully that person put on the ballot and put themselves out there for what they really stand for, what they really believe, and that they would vote that way. And so on the one hand, I understand we're playing a big football game, and if you don't have enough players, you're at a disadvantage. But on the other hand, I feel like it shouldn't be that way, and I don't know how things change if they don't start to change. So I don't think it's going to make a difference in terms of passing things. The things that she wasn't going to vote for in the Democratic Party, she's still not going to vote for. And the ways that she's going to be with the Democratic Party, she's still going to be with them, but she's not labeling herself a Democrat. And I'm kind of happy with that. I know I'm in the minority, but...
So what are the implications of her keeping her committee assignments? Does that mean that ultimately she's going to stand with Democrats when it counts? Or would she use those committee assignments to, I guess, highlight her independence?
Well, I think that, by saying, what she apparently went to Chuck Schumer and said, listen, I want to keep my committee assignments. I think what she's saying is that she's not, the way I read it, okay, that doesn't mean what's what she's saying, but the way I read it was, I'm not changing anything fundamentally from the way I've been behaving for the last few years. I mean, this is still me. It's just that I don't want to label myself this way anymore. I mean, I don't know. I think, we should give it a shot. I mean, first of all, we have no choice, right? She did what she did, and there's nothing, nothing anybody can do to stop her. And, instead of going against her and saying, oh, you horrible person, you jumped you jumped off the track, see what happens. I mean, maybe she'll be more amenable to being convinced of things when she doesn't feel that she's being compelled to go along with the party. I think it's up for grabs.
Dr. Blaine, I think you make some good points, but Kyrsten Sinema is a horrible person, and we just ought to acknowledge that. There are a lot of senators who are horrible people. She happens to be one of them. She has no real principles. I think you're right on this idea that if people were to hold fast to a set of principles, to adopt the position of no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests, then labels really would make a difference, Democrats or Republicans. Kyrsten Sinema is not one of those people who has a set of permanent interests. So she is an opportunist, and she's trying to figure out a way, which most senators do, to keep herself elected. She's not trying to represent her people. She's not trying to represent a set of principles. She wants to remain a United States senator for whatever benefit that presents to her. And that doesn't make her unusual. That in and of itself doesn't make her a horrible person. What makes her a horrible person is that she does not represent her constituents. She won't meet with them. She won't address their issues in any kind of substantive way. She continues to consort with her donors and sees that as her constituency, when 1 million plus people elected her, not the constituents. So she's going to be, like you said, she's going to be who she is. She's not going to change. Chuck Schumer, the other Democrats, the Republicans on the Hill will have to deal with her the same way they dealt with her for the past 4 years or so. And we'll see what happens. We'll win some, we'll lose some if you're a Democrat person. And it'll continue that way. And, hopefully her re-election effort will reap the benefit of her being a horrible person, and some person who is actually more principled will be elected.
But this is the no judgment zone, right?
No. These are judgments. These are absolutely harsh judgments.
But you know what? So there are plenty of other senators that do the same thing, that don't really meet well with their constituents, and they meet more with their donors. So I don't see her as an outlier like that.
No, I acknowledge that. She's not the only one. She's not by herself by any stretch of the imagination. Oh no, I don't. No. She's not by herself at all.
So, Professor Cook, what do you make of the, as someone who may push back on that and say, well, look, she's been effective in getting bipartisan support for the infrastructure bill, and now the marriage equality bill that was just signed into law by President Biden this week. She has come through for Democrats behind the scenes when it comes down to peeling off some Republican support for major Democratic achievements. So therefore, that's a little unfair for you to pounce on her like that. What do you respond?
I don't think it's unfair, because I don't think she's really done anything to bring along any Republicans. She spent a lot of time with Tillis over the past months trying to do this bill for the Dreamers, which appears now to have fundamentally collapsed. Where are the 10 Republicans that she can bring along? This is the same thing that Joe Manchin said. Where are the 10 Republicans that you're going to bring along? So it doesn't happen. It's a lot of talk. There's not much results. And okay, that's fine. But I just don't think she ought to get a medal for doing her job. I don't think she ought to get a medal, or any senator. So it's not just her. It's not personalizing. I don't think any senator ought to get a medal for doing their job. You got to do something extraordinary, and she hasn't done anything extraordinary.
So late Tuesday, Democrats and Republicans have reached a top-line spending agreement for a fiscal 2023 omnibus bill. Senate Appropriations Chairman Patrick Leahy, who is retiring, of Vermont, said in a statement that negotiators had reached a bipartisan bicameral framework that should allow us to finish an omnibus appropriations bill that can pass the House, that can pass the Senate, and be signed into law by the president. Leahy said that he cut the deal with House Appropriations Chair Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut and Senate Appropriations Ranking Member Richard Shelby of Alabama, also retiring, who released similar statements. None of them disclosed the terms of the agreement, however, but it's expected to set defense spending at $858 billion, which is in alignment with the annual authorizing bill the Senate is considering this week. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky said Tuesday that negotiators were getting close on a deal that he said would be broadly appealing and set defense at the $858 billion level, without having to pay a bonus above what President Biden asked for domestic priorities of the Democrats, he says. The two sides had been $26 billion apart on the level of non-defense spending in recent days, with Republicans refusing to go above the top line level of President Joe Biden's budget request at $1.65 trillion. Democrats had been pushing for about $813 billion in non-defense spending, while Republicans had been proposing $787 billion. Democrats earlier had signaled a willingness to move toward the Senate GOP position to secure a deal before Republicans take control of the House next Congress for the 118th Congress. DeLauro said in a statement that the deal provides a path forward for Congress to pass and Biden to sign an omnibus agreement next week. I want to ask you all, who comes out on top in this appropriations bill? Usually we have winners and losers when it comes down to these budget agreements. And it seems to me that the Republicans are getting more of what they want for defense than the Democrats are getting for non-defense spending. What are your takes on that?
I'll start this one off since I've been mostly silent and listening to a good conversation I have. I would say for this whole spending thing, I have to agree that if Republicans, every time it comes to a short-term bill, Republicans normally will end up on top because they want to do less spending and they don't mind for the government to shut down. I mean, we can go back to President over Obama. I might be a little rough on my memory's a little rusty on the years, but when the government shutdown happened, that favored the Republicans. So I think the Republicans are getting more out of it because they're about the military spending, while Democrats tend to focus more on domestic issues. So anything with short term and limitation spending in general, Republicans end up on top, even though they don't always practice what they preach because the debt ceiling keeps going up all the time. So that's all I gotta say for that. I just think the Republicans will end up on top because we gotta keep doing this omnibus bill, which gets very annoying. But the Republicans seem to like that, especially when it shuts down and collapse.
Yeah, Mike, it's usually, this happens every few years. It's, I would say the winner is usually the party that's not in power. All right. So like this happened a few years ago, when Trump was the president and he was pushing for more funding towards his border wall. It happened, during the Obama administration. But at the end of the day, you keep pushing this and then the government actually shuts down. The people are going to blame the party they see in power. Right? They're gonna say, well, this is the Biden administration. This is the Biden government, or this was a Trump administration. So, the longer this plays out, the worse it becomes for the Democrats. Saying that I think is a healthy debate to be had every single year. I'm thinking, hopefully they can work this out. This doesn't turn into, what happened a few years ago. But like the longer this plays out, I think the worse it is for the party that's in power. Because majority of Americans, are not really keen into this conversation. But if this becomes a bigger deal, the party in power is going to, be hurt the most.
As for big winners, Mike, it's the big winners, as always, are going to be Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman, the three biggest defense contractors in the country, because, of all the military spending, which again, I think it's incredibly unconscionable that there are people who are sleeping on the streets while we're spending hundreds of $billions of dollars on warfare. As far as, the actual process of hammering out a deal, there are, realities in the Democratic Party that they have such a narrow majority that's become even more narrow with the resignation of Karen Bass to become mayor of Los Angeles, and with the death of, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now, but that representative in Virginia. They can't afford a lot of defections, so this is going to have to be, I'm sorry?
McEachin.
Thank you. With Representative McEachin, there is, the fact of the matter is that Democrats can't afford a lot of no votes from their own party if every single Republican votes no, and you have to worry about the stuff in your pocket first before you start going after what's not there. So they have to at least put their names on this bill, on a massive spending bill. I just, whatever we were willing to spend on military. I think it was Joe Biden himself who likes to say, show me your budget and I'll show you your morals. We have to remember every time the government starts spending money that no one ever asks how we'll ever pay for, war, how we'll ever pay for weapons, how we'll ever pay for defense contractors. But when it's time to actually do something that helps working people, that's when the budget hawks, start coming out.
So House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who is doing whatever he can to garner the secured amount of votes that he needs to become the next speaker and replace Nancy Pelosi, he is opposed to any omnibus package. And there's a broad view in his conference that they shouldn't pass anything. No final spending bill until next year after they've assumed control in the House of Representatives. House Minority Whip Steve Scalise of Louisiana earlier Tuesday sent out a whip notice urging his side to vote against even the 1 week bill, arguing that they shouldn't help set the table for an omnibus bill next week. And of course, McCarthy's taking to the Fox News airwaves saying, why would McConnell even try to negotiate at this point? Let's take control of the House first, and criticizing him in public. And of course, aides to McConnell are saying that he was a little startled or taken back by those comments. What is the reasoning, do you think, behind McCarthy's approach to this whole negotiation process? And do you think it will ultimately blow up in his face?
The logic is he wants to be Speaker of the House desperately. And he needs to feed this sort of extreme element in his caucus who is oppositional to most anything that a Democrat would propose. Irrespective of the substance, irrespective of the impact on the American economy or government. So I think it's really a very base sort of strategy. These guys seem to want to take hostages. The problem with taking hostages is at some point you have to be willing to shoot the hostage. And I don't know if they are, but they seem to want to make everybody think that they're going to take the government hostage to get what they want. And that's why they don't want to vote for anything now, and they don't want to vote anything on the other side of January until they get exactly what they want. And that's a very tough position. I don't believe that philosophically Mitch McConnell believes that is a good place to be for the Republican Party. And that may be why he is willing to talk about doing something in the short term, because he knows when his Republican colleagues take over the House, that type of short-term deal just isn't going to be politically available.
It's really interesting that you raised this whole issue by saying who comes out on top, and the thing that just kind of, it just strikes me all the time is the choice of who comes out on top is never the American population. It's never the people. And it should be all about, what do the people need so that the people come out on top, and not, which side gets it. It just always seems like it's so much ego and people not really working together. And it's just really sad to me. I don't have an answer for that.
I agree with Deborah 100%.
It's interesting because Kevin McCarthy knows he does not have the numbers to be Speaker. He's even privately started to acknowledge that. Republicans on Capitol Hill are preparing for the Speaker vote to extend far past January 3rd. The only thing that keeps him afloat is the fact that his opponents don't have a viable candidate to be the Speaker, and there's no indication that Democrats are going to help Republicans out with that. So, his way, and remember that Republicans spent the summer campaigning on cutting Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, is, when a conservative is in charge and when we're running the committees that are in charge of spending the money, we'll get a budget that's good for Republicans. And, that's the message that they want to bring back. But Kevin McCarthy doesn't have the numbers to be Speaker. So if he gets his way, I don't think it would necessarily be very good for the country. It would almost, in my opinion, guarantee a government shutdown, because I don't think that with a narrow Republican majority in the House and a Democratic majority in the Senate, that, a bill that'll make both sides happy, both Kevin McCarthy and the Republican caucus and the crazies in the caucus who are trying to block him from becoming speaker, I don't think it creates a very, positive situation, especially when we're talking about funding the government, which isn't just funding government programs, but also paying the government employees that are charged with carrying out these programs.
Yeah, Mike, and I think Dr. Blaine really hit it right on the nail. It really talks about what's the frustration that I think the American public, historically, have with politics, right? And I think people who are familiar with, there's a lot of literature about like public choice theory that kind of explains, the political decision making and of politicians, and sometimes it kind of conflates with what is the general public view on certain things. Is really, it's about like, a lot of political actors are acting in their best interest, their best political interest, right? So here in this situation, right, the American people will be losing in this situation. But for McCarthy, he is looking, in his political interest, which is becoming speaker, and he's realizing he has a very slim majority in the party, right, in the Republican Party in the House. And, it could be a situation where you have your, kind of like your far right, more radical, MAGA Trump folks in the House who decide, look, I'm not voting for McCarthy, right? And then you could have this middle of the road type of moderate Republican who's saying, look, I'm bringing 4 or 5 Republicans with me, and all the Democrats are going to vote for me, all right? We're going to have this type of, coalition where I, have an agreement with Hakeem Jeffries and the Democratic Party to put forth a more moderate Republican. So those are real fears. So for him at this point, he's like, I can't have any distracted, like people leave, my coalition when I need them to vote for me to become the speaker. So he's going to do things right now that is not in the interest of the American public. And that is why people, really hate politics, right? But these people are moving in their own self-interest. And that's what all I see here with McCarthy.
So during these budget negotiations, I can't help but think about 11 years ago during the negotiations over what was called the Grand Bargain with President Barack Obama, Eric Cantor, John Boehner, and Paul Ryan. In that time period, you had Boehner and Obama meeting regularly at the White House for a period of time, both trying to get to a number that both men could agree on as it pertains to a debt ceiling bill. They finally came down to $1.2 trillion. And Eric Cantor, who later on, admitted to being responsible for taking Boehner off the ledge and telling him to reject the deal, caused the deal to blow up. And Obama, it was evident that he was frustrated, and he took to the press conference and said, will they say yes to anything? Will they say yes to anything? And of course, Eric Cantor, his mindset was that he wanted to take the issue of taxes and healthcare to the voters in the 2012 election rather than strike a big deal with Obama. And he said, when we get to the debt ceiling negotiations, there was yet an analogous vein we could have proceeded on, which would have gotten us this grand bargain, big deal, but could have gotten us a little step in the right direction toward trying to restrain costs and expenditures. He goes on to explain why he thought it was more advantageous for them to wait for the election. Now, of course, the election didn't go in the way they wanted. And so then they come back to the deal that they agreed on to begin with. And Obama says, no, I'm not going to take that. So the Obama-Boehner grand bargain proposal did not happen. Will the Republicans, if they go along with Kevin McCarthy, end up in the same situation where they could get a good deal now, but because they want to hold out for later when they take control, they're setting themselves up for getting egg on their face, basically, because they'll find that things are much more difficult once they get to that proposed place. To that ideal place that they want to be.
I think it's very likely, and I don't forget the consequences that Eric Cantor had to face for his actions. He ended up getting primaried in 2014, I believe, because of his role in helping Obama pass a budget. And then the guy that primaried him eventually lost his seat to a Democrat. But remember, voters don't like foolishness. There's a certain amount of entertainment that voters will tolerate, but on its face, you get sent to Washington to get things done, not to play with people's livelihoods. And Eric Cantor especially had a high number of federal employees in his district. His district is the Richmond suburbs, so he had a lot of his constituents were federal contractors, federal employees, and he played stupid games and he won stupid prizes. So, you know, McCarthy can't allow himself to get drawn into that if he wants to maintain his grip on power and the speakership. You know, there's no telling what kind of politician would be able to primary him out in California, or what his own caucus will punish him with doing.
So this was also an interesting week because this was the week in which President Biden hosted African countries to Washington, D.C. And of course, President Joe Biden had a tough task ahead of him, and that was to woo them away from China. The 49 leaders invited to the second ever U.S. Africa Leaders Summit have gotten years of infrastructure investment and sweetheart trade deals from China, while U.S. policy toward Africa has been far less ambitious and akin to what some critics call benign neglect. Biden's challenge was to convince African leaders that his administration is ready to deliver robust diplomatic and economic engagement on the continent, and that he'll commit the necessary resources to rival China as Africa's superpower of choice. He said many African leaders, of course, feel that they've already been fooled once when President Barack Obama used the first summit in 2014 to signal growing commitment to the continent. Instead, Obama ended up cutting funding to combat AIDS in Africa and reduce foreign aid in the region. China, however, has become sub-Saharan Africa's #1 trading partner through imports of everything from textiles to smartphones, while purchasing massive volumes of African agricultural products and commodities, including copper and oil. And Beijing has built roads and ports across Africa over the past 2 decades, while regularly increasing its foreign aid to the continent. And Chinese foreign ministers have made Africa their first foreign destination of each new calendar year since 1991. Obama started this in trying to get the focus away from Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East, and getting us to compete, against China for the 21st century. And this summit in 2014, of course, was a key step towards that goal. I want to ask if you think President Biden struck the right chord with this summit, and whether or not, this summit may have been more successful than the last one. Did he make promises that you think realistically the United States wouldn't be able to keep? I want to get your take on this summit.
Well, I think.
Oh, please go.
Go ahead, Brother Strawberry.
Well, I think the United States has a really big hill to climb here. Like you said, it's very plain that China, and I think also to a lesser extent Russia, are the elephants in the room with regard to the summit, even though the summit is the people who are invited are the African leaders. Really, the people dominating the room are not in the room. It is China and Russia to a lesser extent. Africa's influence on the global stage is growing, while at the same time, U.S. influence over Africa, particularly relative to these other nations, is shrinking. And I think that the UN General Assembly vote to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the 17 abstentions from the African nations, really surprised people. I think that it shook people that happened that way. People kind of don't really have a good understanding of the history between Africa and the United States. A lot of people on the continent don't really trust the United States or the United States-led world order because of the U.S.'s involvement in Africa over the last few decades. I mean, centuries, really. Looking at many of us on this conversation, that's visible. But most recently, during the Cold War, which we have to remember was not a Cold War in Africa, but a hot war in really all the global South. The African liberation struggles were concurrent to that Cold War. And while the Soviets, who became the Russians, obviously, were usually on the side of the people who were trying to liberate themselves, the United States, if it took a side, tended to be on the side of the oppressors in those conflicts. And so I think that and its modern echoes explain some of the way that vote happened on condemning the Russian invasion. And I think that's part of the hill the United States is trying to climb right now. Even earlier this year, there was the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act that was passed almost unanimously by Congress after that vote. And it was received by a lot of people on the continent as a sort of punishment for the way that those nations voted in the assembly. And this summit's also happening as Biden has ordered troops back into Somalia after Trump had withdrawn them. So there's a lot that the United States is trying to do here and sort of make up for. There's a few tangibles, which is great. $55 billion in investment, offering to support a permanent Security Council seat from Africa. That'd be a big deal. Having an African nation join the G20 is great. Those are tangibles, and I look forward to hearing about more of those. But the United States really has to compete. They really have to compete because China's in the game, Russia's in the game, other countries are going to be coming into the game. And so it's not like the United States can take any of this for granted. So I hope that they have another forum like this. China's been having them since 2000, since the year 2000. So Obama had the one in 2014. China's been having them every 3 years since 2000, systematically every 3 years. They have had 8. So the United States has a lot that it needs to do in this regard if it wants to have success and having an influence on the continent that is comparable to what China has. And again, even Russia.
No, I agree. That's the challenge, and the American worldview that we're the most powerful country in the world, and our empire encompasses the African continent is not a view shared by many leaders in Africa, and the Russians and the Chinese have made a much more significant investment in the infrastructure in those companies and job creation and economic development in those countries than the U.S. has. And the problem is that the American president doesn't get to drive the bus. You've got to play ball with the Congress of the United States. And the political dynamics that fracture that relationship prevent the United States from having a consistent and a comprehensive approach to the African continent that would be of benefit to the United States long term, because other petty political differences get in the way. And you mentioned it obliquely, racism gets in the way, and that makes it difficult for the United States to be considered a real partner for most African nations.
So President Biden vowed to invest what aids calculated would equal $55 billion on the continent of Africa over the next 3 years, while supporting its ambitions for greater global leadership and bolstering efforts to transform it into a more prosperous, healthier, and technologically advanced region. What do you make about this? What do you make of this decision by the president to not just invest in terms of a symbolic investment, but also a tangible $55 billion price tag investment?
Yeah, Mike, I think it is. I think it's very significant. Right. I think that is a very significant investment. From the American government. I think the big thing coming out of the entire summit was the statement that the Biden administration was going to stand for the African Union to join the G20, as like Jordan talked about. Like that will give the African nations such a bigger say on some of these big ticket type of items. Like we talk about food security, we talk about climate change, we talk about the economic future, long-term security of a lot of these nations. I think it is like very, very important and is a significant investment. But at the same time, you have countries like China, as Jordan articulated, who are showing that they might be better partners right now, or more committed partners, because we discussed how the Obama administration kind of introduced this conversation. But what we haven't discussed is the way that the Trump administration really just turned, a blind eye to this. Like this whole American first policy, that the Trump administration kind of pushed was really, in part saying that we're not dealing with, the African Union or these African countries in the same way that the Obama administration, was really committed to, in the same way that Biden administration. So, you're the African nation, you say, well, look, Joe Biden, you're telling me, you want to invest into our long-term security. But what happens in 4 years from now? Like if you're no longer president and Trump is president again, and when Trump showed us that he do not care at all about the African Union and, this relationship. So, if you're trying to weigh, who's a better partner long-term, I mean, you have to really show that you can be trusted more than China. And I think that, we have to do more to gain their trust. This is a good first step. But we have to do more, things that are tangible to really show our commitment to the African Union.
But the question is, can we be trusted more than China? I mean, their question, could be my question too, because if, I don't know who's going to be elected in 2024, whether it's Biden or another Democrat, but what if it's not? What if it's a DeSantos or somebody like that? Like, can we be trusted? I mean, they're not, I agree with you 100%. They're not wrong, and they have to look at their future. We're seeing everything from from our perspective, but from their perspective, we're just one other big country, big monster out there who's vying for their wealth, and their resources. So I agree with you. I'm not sure that if I were there, that I would choose us.
I agree with Dr. Blaine. I think for the first time, the African leadership is in a position of being able to make their own choices on their destiny. Of being able to tell the U.S. put up or shut up, because if you don't provide this, we already have China and Russia in our backyard to build us roads and bridges and planes, trains, and automobiles. What are you going to do for us other than put in a few $1 billion for, whatever you say? And how do we know that we're going to have this $1 billion through 2025 and beyond, when all we know is that Joe Biden is president till 2024, till early 2025?
So China has more potential friends in the continent than the United States, largely because it's embraced countries regardless of their respect for democracy or human rights. Has the United States stance for democracy and human rights served as a roadblock in making headway with relations with African countries, in your view? And how can the United States overcome that to compete with China's influence in that region?
Democracy and human rights is a message that plays well over here. It doesn't necessarily play well when you're someone in an African country who sees American soldiers in your capital city to back up the dictator that people in your capital city are rallying to get out. So, when we say the commitment to democracy and human rights, is it democracy as long as the person we're kicking out is not a socialist, or is it democracy where the people get to choose their own leaders?
And it was just a couple of months ago, or not even, that we were not sure that we were about our own democracy. So, it's really hard to convince them, oh, democracy is but the US is like, yeah, are you a democracy or aren't you a democracy? Do you guys go by your votes or not go, so, I mean, we're in such a state of flux that I don't think that we give people a reason to be, really trusting of us. I'm not so trusting of us. We made it through the last election, but who knows? Hopefully that'll stay. But
yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question, Mike, because at this point, what credibility do we really have, when we're talking about democracy and spreading democracy across the world, when our democracy is such in flux? But, in that second part where you talk about human rights, that might not be something that we want to sacrifice because of economic reasons, right? It's beneficial for us to partner with other countries for economic reasons, and there could be very national security concerns. But some of these human rights issues, let's talk about what those issues really are. We're talking about issues, and this is not just focused on Africa. This is focused all across the world with issues dealing with women's rights, right, throughout the world, issues dealing with LGBT rights. And there are countries that are really still to this day have very archaic type of laws that are in place in those countries, where we can't just turn a blind eye. Now, we can't stand on this moral high ground as if we are better than everybody in the world and we can just kind of lecture to everybody, because we have our own problems here, very significant problems. But you have to really weigh those type of values. It's like, look, we want to, do this because this is in our economic, best interest. But at the same time, who are we to turn a blind eye to some of these very real social justice issues that is going on in some of these countries? So, it's a very difficult question. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, right? I think it's very complicated. And I think every administration is going to have to, weigh those different value sets.
So last Friday, Americans woke up to the news that Brittney Griner, WNBA star, was finally coming home to the United States. The WNBA star Brittney Griner, who was held for months in Russian prisons on drug charges, was released Thursday in a 1-for-1 prisoner swap for notorious international arms dealer Victor Bout, also known as the Merchant of Death, bringing an end to an ordeal that has sparked intense high-level negotiations between Washington D.C. and Moscow to secure her freedom. Of course, critics have started to wring their hands in the aftermath of that swap, including former President Donald Trump, who was questioned why Brittney Griner was freed in a prisoner swap with Russia while Paul Whelan remains jailed. Current and former National Security Council officials say such negotiations aren't so simple, however. Griner was released from detainment after spending 10 months in custody, charged with the large-scale transportation of drugs after Russian officials said vape cartridges with hash oil were found in her luggage at Moscow's airport. The United States released the notorious Russian arms dealer Victor Bout, often referred to as the Merchant of Death, while Paul Whelan's release has been the topic of ongoing negotiations between the Biden administration and Russian officials, and he was not included in the prisoner swap ultimately. Do you believe that Republican critics have a point there? Was this a one-sided deal? You have people like Representative Ryan, I believe, saying, that he's disappointed that not enough has been done to secure Paul Whelan's freedom. The America-hating basketball player, someone said, for the Merchant of Death has been released. The American-hating basketball player was released for the Merchant of Death, especially when the former Marine is not even included. It's a one-sided disaster and a big win for Russia in all caps. That was Trump, who posted on his Truth Social media page. Is there some merit to the criticism that has been sparked as a result of this prisoner exchange?
Mike, let's be clear. This is not about Paul Whelan. Like the criticism from Republicans has nothing really to do with that. Like there was no discussion about him over the last year or two. Like this is really, if we want to really get down to it, this is the fact that, this is not just a Black woman, right, who they value her life a lot less, right? This is a Black LGBT woman, right? And they're like, well, this is not a valuable exchange for us. Like we're giving up this person, this merchant, the Merchant of Death. That's, that's not a great nickname to have. But, like at the end of the day, like the American government, there was a cost benefit analysis and there's been determination that, he no longer poses such a significant threat. But at the end of the day, like when I hear these discussions, these people who haven't talked about Paul Whelan in years, now bringing this up, that this is really just like smoke and mirrors. Like the real issue really is the fact that, this is Brittney Griner. If this was Tom Brady, if this was, a great baseball player, a great soccer, like a white soccer player, they would see the value in that person's life and they will be outraged. They're like, we have to do whatever we can to get this person back. This is, we have to stand. This is unpatriotic. But the fact that this was a Black woman, not just a Black woman, but a Black LGBT woman, right, who they do not value at all. It was like, well, what about this and what about that? But at the end of the day, I'm happy that Brittney Griner is back. Like, look, I'm from Houston. Brittney is from Nimitz High School, which is a rival high school from when I went to. I remember being on the freshman basketball team, watching her. She was a senior, and like she is a giant in Texas. She's a giant in WNBA. She's a world-renowned figure. And, I think there is some merit to discussion about our policy going forward, about negotiating, with like Russia with these type of, made up charges with people, because it incentivizes them to do this again in the future. But this isn't the first time. This has happened with Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan traded arms, with Iran. This happened during the Obama administration. But I really think that this issue and all these people who have been outraged and throwing out these names about Paul Whelan and other people, this is really about Brittney Griner and this country not valuing like Black women.
Yeah, and don't be confused that Vladimir Putin doesn't recognize exactly what is going on. His political advantage is to feed into this lunacy that the Biden administration values a gay black woman more than it does a white Marine. And Putin knows that. And these Republicans fall right into that trap or parrot that foolishness. There is no country in the world that is absolutism, that is an absolutist about we never exchange hostages. Everybody does it more or less publicly, but everybody does it. So this idea that you never trade a hostage as is the only way to prevent a hostage from being taken is baloney. Every country in the world trades their hostages for something. And sometimes they do it off camera. Sometimes they do it in front of the cameras. So yeah, it made sense to do. You can't make the Russians trade something they don't want to trade. And at the end of the day, you had a decision to make. Am I going to get the one I can get, or am I going to insist on getting the one I can't get? And the president chose to take the one he could get. You don't have to like it, but that was the deal that was to be had. And Putin drove that deal because he knew that he would get this same reaction among Republicans that could, in his view, weaken Joe Biden, create confusion in the American public, the American electorate. That was an objective to be achieved all by itself, as far as he's concerned.
Look, until last week, most Americans did not know who Paul Whelan was. Let's just be honest. Same with Victor Bout. It's not until Brittney, a black woman, was released instead of one of them, instead of Whelan, that everyone was, well, Joe Biden should have tried to get Paul Whelan out too. And it was very clear 10 months ago when she was first arrested in Russia. And let's be clear, the reason Brittney Griner was in Russia in the first place is because Russia subsidizes women's sports. So women athletes over there can actually make money to not just feed themselves, but also train and hone their craft, which is an opportunity she doesn't have here playing for the WNBA. Brittney Griner was a pawn for Putin, who was lashing out at the fact that the West had basically isolated him against the rest of the world after his invasion of Ukraine. Brittney, look, we should be glad that an American woman is free, right? And if people want to talk about Brittney Griner was trafficking drugs, Paul Whelan is in jail because he was doing corporate espionage, and that was after he got kicked out of the Marines for, being a scammer. So obviously no one is perfect. I would like Paul Whelan to come home too, but I'd also like Trump to explain why, when he was in the White House for 4 years, he did nothing to get Paul Whelan out either. So, let's zoom out and look at the big picture here. An American is free. More people know now that there are still Americans who are not free. Paul Whelan's family is enthusiastic and said Joe Biden made the right choice to bring home someone he could bring home instead of keeping both people locked up abroad for much longer. So, let's celebrate. Someone's home.
And I misquoted the representative a little bit earlier. Representative Mike Waltz of Florida called the swap shameful. He questioned why a celebrity is being released over a veteran. And Representative Tim Walberg of Michigan added, President Biden has left Paul Whelan behind. When you look at another representative, Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, he said, so POTUS just traded an enemy who smuggles guns and helps shoot Americans for an American who smuggles drugs and shoots basketballs, all while a former U.S. Marine, Paul Whelan, rots in a Russian prison. I just wanted to paint the picture of those who disagree with what's been said. Any other thoughts before we wrap things up?
Yeah, Mr. Cook referenced this, but it's just so interesting how closely those comments parrot the comments being made on Russian media. I watched some clips and it was like the exact same thing. They're like, oh, they let this. I mean, they specifically always make a point to point out that she's lesbian. Like they let this lesbian out instead of one of their heroes who shed blood for the country. And it's the same type of. They're actually a little bit more blatant with it, but it's the same type of commentary that the right wing, press is making. So I like that her life was made a priority. It's something tangible beyond a PR move. I think it will make a positive difference for Biden ultimately. Black women, and specifically queer Black women, are often his most influential critics from the left. And not to play, into people's identity defining how they're going to react to things, but I think this will be seen as more than a small gesture. from a purely pragmatic perspective, I think it will help him in the long term.
And let's be clear, taking the big picture, like Nate said, Russian President Putin, a little bit earlier this month, signed into law a bill that expands a ban on so-called LGBTQ propaganda in Russia, making it illegal for anyone to promote same-sex relationships or suggest that non-heterosexual orientations are normal. Now, it's all about political messaging. So if he released this prisoner while simultaneously signing such a bill into law, it continues to give him this image of being staunchly against the LGBTQ community, and I guess hinders any kind of fear that he may have about him looking weak in the process of this prisoner exchange. I thought that the timing of this bill wasn't by happenstance or coincidence. To your point, Jordan, they made a huge issue in Russian news about her sexual orientation, and I think in alignment with that, this bill was signed to I guess douse any fear, douse any doubt. Just to throw water on any doubts, right? That Putin was caving in any way to the community, to the LGBTQ community. Any other thoughts?
Well, the merchant of death was not in prison for the rest of his life. He was going to get out anyway. He was only 6 years short of being released. I say only. I wouldn't want to be in jail 6 more years anyway. But it's not like you had a guy who had a death sentence or a life sentence. He was going to get out. So, there's much furor or much to do on the side of the so-called conservatives that are trying to score political points, but not really rational points at all.
Who comes out looking stronger, Biden or Putin?
It depends on whether which side of the coin you're on, whether you're a pro-Putin person or not. I mean, look, I think the president did what a president had to do, and that's good enough. And you're going to get criticized by some people, but I think you'll get more support from more people.
I think Putin looks stronger in the stereotypical type of sense of what it means to be stronger. Like, yeah, I got a killer out. I got somebody who's one of our killers out. So that makes you kind of come across as strong. But I think that in terms of making a decision that is the right decision, that is a hard decision, I think, I'm not going to be the one to big up Biden every day, but this one, I will. I like this decision. And I think it was a very strong decision because you know the pushback you're going to get, and you did it anyway. So I respect that. So that to me is strength.
Yeah. Well, with that being said, thank you, Mr. Ellis, Losing Empire, Jerry Ford, Professor Cook, Nate Honoré, Dr. Blaine, Jordan Strudwick. This was a very insightful, a very rich discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed each of your contributions to episode 88 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in. As I do every week, I just want to encourage those who tune in to refrain from sketchy sources of news and to plug in to reputable sources and challenge those reputable sources of news that you do plug into. That's the most basic responsibility of a citizen, to be informed, and in addition to participation in democracy. So thank you all for what you brought to the table. I will now conclude. That concludes episode 88 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all so much.